Don't be scared by any of the stuff anyone tells you. Plan ahead, but go. If you're willing to listen, willing to be a little bit humble, you go into it where I'm going to learn from this thing, then people are going to be very open to you around the world.
You want to tell us how things began with you?
My old man was in the Air Force in Beale Air Force Base, California. We moved here in 1976, shortly after he left. So I grew up in Lancaster, and my folks both had wanderlust, and they traveled as much as they could, and kind of were into whatever new and adventurous activities they could get to. So I kind of learned from a young age that it was really easy to do that. Earliest opportunity I had, like shortly after high school, moved out to Colorado. Spent a year working construction and being a ski bum, climbing rad, all that kind of stuff, and then moved up to Bozeman, Montana, to go to college, and ended up kind of getting into ethnomusicology and sort of radio production while I was up there for about 10 years in Montana. And then from there, that took me to a lot of kind of more international gigs in ethnomusicology, audio recording, filmmaking, photography, and that lasted a good 20 years. And then sort of at the end of that, I followed a girl to Canada. I lived there for about a year, got deported, and now I've been back in Lancaster again, sort of taking care of family. And I think learned a lot along that time that family is one of those things that you kind of come back to. You leave traveling to find all the excitement in the world, and you come back when you realize the value of it. So nice. That's the short version.
So what made you want to move to Colorado?
Oh, snow.
Snow?
Mountains. This was 1994. I guess the X Games and Red Bull had not become the industries that they are yet. It was still more of a sleep out of the back of your car and go ski or climb every day and ride mountain bikes and do weird stuff like that. So I just wanted to do that. I was young and dumb, and that's what I thought to do.
Sounds great.
You were a music major, right?
I was, but I wasn't playing music that much at that point. I played a piano as like a little kid, but like hadn't really gotten into it. It was sort of being a 90s, I don't know, hippie punk that kind of did that. So
you call yourself a ethnomusicologist. What is that for people who have no idea what that is?
I would say I'm not like a real proper ethnomusicologist. I don't have a PhD in it or anything. I would say a guerrilla ethnomusicologist, sort of. Basically, I'm looking for musical traditions that come from places where we don't hear about a lot. There's, every little valley's got its own little musical traditions, and if it's isolated long enough, those become distinct from the neighboring valley. So you look all around the world, there's just thousands of places and cultures and people that have been doing things slightly different from their neighbor. Even if dad knows a song and he teaches his two kids that same tune, their grandkids are going to play it a little bit different. So listening to those variations and how music travels and goes to different places and changes, that's what I was really interested in. Sometimes I try to describe it where you hear of world music sometimes, like sold at Starbucks and the bright Puto Mayo things. That's like world music with a capital W. I'm looking for world music with the lowercase w, which is the stuff where no one's ever going to record them. Maybe they're a little scratchy. Their guitar isn't like nice and new, straight from the store. It's been beaten up, and maybe they're a little beaten up too, and the songs are a little beaten up, and the whole thing sounds a little more authentic. It's music people play on the porch instead of the stage.
What drove you to leave the country?
I guess I had left the country with my family when I was younger, but the first time doing this for like the purposes of sort of chasing music was with a university professor out at Montana State who had gone to Bali, and he had gone there and spent like sabbaticals writing Balinese music and having Balinese gamelan ensembles perform his pieces. And I went as part of a group with him and was kind of doing recordings and documentation of his work there and learning on my own and stuff. But then I ended up staying. I kind of changed my ticket and stayed for the maximum amount that you were allowed to stay, and traveled around Indonesia with a DAT recorder and a microphone, just trying to record whatever I could find, and just deciding this is what I wanted to do. Just got to figure out how to get paid for it.
What was it like just going into these valleys, as you say, and just meeting these indigenous or...
The first thing I would do, I traveled with a small guitar at that time, and most of the time when I was doing a lot of this, I'd have at least some kind of instrument with me. Guitar is pretty popular. You're going to find someone who plays it everywhere. So if you show up in some small village and you have a guitar, it's going to be the first thing that anybody talks about. Or, if there's a language gap, it's the first thing that you can communicate with without knowing the local language or whatever. I try to learn the language as much as possible, but it's, you can only go so far as a tourist, basically. So showing up in these places, you just kind of look for other musicians, and you'd find people who'd want to play, and if you're friendly and open and willing to listen more than perform your own thing. You show up there and you're like, here's my awesome lick. You're not gonna find anything. But if you go there and you listen to what people are interested in, even if it's like really bad Guns N' Roses covers or whatever it is, like which is popular in a lot of the world, that's not going to be whatever. You'll find it if you're listening for it, and eventually that'll take you to the places that are legitimately interesting.
You adapted and learned languages everywhere you went.
At least enough to be friendly or funny or whatever.
So did you just pick up on it, or was there somebody that spoke English enough to be able to translate for you?
Usually there's a necessity for that. Yeah,
Sure.
like there's some situations, in Spanish-speaking countries, or even to some degree Romance language-speaking countries. I can speak a little Nepali, a little Thai. It's probably gone now, but you learn enough to get around. You learn enough to ask what's the name of the song, so you don't have to rely on the translator for like basic information. And you learn, what's your name, who wrote that song, where did that come from, before you start a recording session or
Sure.
something. But of course you need someone there who can at least help you out with a little bits of that,
Yeah.
make sure they get on tape. And there's a lot of stuff that I have that is untranslated, and I don't even know what the subjects of some of the songs are. It's just there's an endless queue of these. These recordings are in the thousands now, so it's there's a lot of that I may never get completely done, and they'll just be an archive for someone else to figure out.
So what are your plans to do with all this recorded music you've collected?
Basically, well, it depends on what the location and the situation was. Some of it is donated to like university libraries. The University of Virginia, for example, has a Himalayan and Tibetan kind of archive, and I made some significant recordings in Tibet when Americans were still allowed to go there, and a lot of those recordings ended up going to that organization with the understanding that they were going to send me translations of some of the songs, but that's not happened yet. They don't have the resources to do it. But basically, anyone who's doing anything academic or for nonprofit purposes, I'll generally donate the recordings. If it's for commercial use, then we try to have some arrangement that the original artist, if I have their contact information and I'm able to get a communication channel, try to get it so that they get a fair shake from it. Some of the other stuff are commercially available recordings, but we'll get to that later.
So how remote were some of these areas that your travels, where it took you?
I don't know what the most remote is, but one of the ones in the Southeast Solomon Islands, I've worked there on a project for, I guess, since 2007. On and off every couple of years, I end up going there for when the funding's available and things work out. Let's see, you fly into Honiara, which is Guadalcanal, you remember from World War II. But then from there, if there's enough fuel at the last airport, you'll fly a day kind of hopping on these grass airfields. Again, they're just remnants from World War II. You'll fly to there, just a grass strip on a tiny island in the middle of nowhere. This is like north of Vanuatu, northeast of New Zealand. It's easier to show on a map, but from there you're in usually a motor canoe, which is just a 20-foot fiberglass, outboard motor kind of thing. In massive deep ocean, you're passing this very active, like conical volcano, and over to some random reefs that are there. And then from there, it's another 100 nautical miles to this other place that has no internet, no mobile phone towers, no airplane, not even a place for a ship to anchor. Those guys are pretty remote. So I don't know what it is. Those remote places are really fun. If it's hard to get to, if you can't get, like almost anywhere on Earth, it feels like if we read about it in National Geographic or whatever, almost all those places, like you could get there in like 48 hours. The places that are harder than that are kind of the cooler places because the stuff, our stuff doesn't get there and their stuff doesn't get to us, and that makes them kind of interesting.
So are you alone when you do all this traveling, or do you go with a group of people? Or
Sometimes. I mean, I think as I get older, I want things to be prepared a little bit more in advance. I want there to be more communication with where I'm going. But that mostly has to do with now there's time limits on how long I'm in these places. And if satellite phone is the only communication with the outside world, if that's even possible, so, there's all kinds of electrical considerations and stuff in some of these places. But definitely, and the place I just described, you need to bring your own solar power to keep things going. And film production is crazy at that point. But anyway, but yeah, I try to do it more with groups or with things that are a little bit more organized in advance. But I still really appreciate when I can go and just take off and have have an open schedule, have a couple of weeks at least to really get to know people, because you can't learn this stuff in a weekend. It takes a little time to develop those relationships with people that you're going to meet, so that you can really offer things to share to each other in an open way.
Do you still communicate with some of them?
In as much as they have communication,
Right.
absolutely, yeah. And I try to, and the good thing about it is once you have those kind of relationships, you can travel anywhere and it feels like home in a lot of ways. So relationships, like anywhere, they fall by the wayside and new ones develop. But I try to stay in touch with as many folks as possible. I just saw one of the Solomons guys a few months ago.
Is that right? Mm-hmm. You flew out to see him? Or?
No, we're working on a film for this organization. It's vaka.org, VAKA. If you like the film Moana, you'd be interested in this, because it's about these sailors and boat builders who do traditional Polynesian navigation. Some people have heard of the Hokulea. It's a Hawaiian-based organization like this. These guys are a little bit smaller, but it's very authentic. They live this kind of sailing and navigation lifestyle, probably very similar to the way that they did thousands of years ago. But we're working on a documentary film series about these boats and the community surrounding them. And so it used to be a couple times a year I would go to Hawaii to work with some of these guys. It's kind of a halfway point between mainland United States and this part of the Solomons, where there's electricity and fast internet and the things you need to finish a film.
Sure.
Things Americans need to finish a film. These
Sure.
guys can work on busted hard drives and zero sand and everything. But
Sure.
So who sponsors these trips? You mentioned before, staying in a place as long as you can get someone to pay you to do it. So how how do you fund all these trips?
This is a challenge. In the older days, and when I say older, for me that means like pre-2008, I was producing programs for NPR, like those 3-minute little cultural things that have now gone by the wayside and sent to podcast land, where you can have a mattress company sponsor you to do them, I guess. But it's always been a challenge. It's always been a challenge for people who've done this. I wonder how Alan Lomax did his recordings and was able to get Library of Congress to fund his work. I'm sure there were some heavy grant applications going on for that. But usually, the one in the Solomons, that particular project was, they have their own donors. They're a 501c3 nonprofit based in Hawaii that supports this group and is interested in producing these films. Some of the other projects, for example, one we did in Nepal on the similarities between Appalachian folk music and Himalayan folk music. In that particular project, we had a donor who was just particularly interested in Himalayan art and was willing to support projects that were into that. It's a lot of it is who you know, a lot of it is how you act, a lot of it is doing what you say you'll do. But it's a constant struggle. Most independent filmmakers spend most of their time looking for money, and not much time actually making films, which is sad. But I guess it weeds out people who don't really want to do it. That said, as I get older, I don't want to do that kind of nonstop rushing for funding to produce films anymore. I'd rather have something that's a little more even on your day-to-day life and knowing when a paycheck is coming or how you're going to eat next week or whatever.
Was there a certain project you can look back on and be like, that was probably my favorite project I've done?
Oh, I mean, there's a lot of them. The one in Nepal, I'd mentioned Tibet earlier. Back during that time when I was traveling there, walking down the streets in Lhasa, Tibet, and I'm carrying a small guitar, and I hear some very clearly Southern American voices. And we meet, we start chatting. It's like, oh, it's like the other Americans here, and we're musicians, like we're practically kin. And ended up talking to this couple, and they were from Virginia and were way into old time and bluegrass music and Appalachian culture in general, and were particularly good. One of them works both as a studio and is a kind of musician, Danny Nicely. You'll see him touring around the East Coast. But particularly down in Virginia, he's very well respected as a multi-instrumentalist, mandolinist, guitarist, fiddle player. You see him down at like Gale Axe and some of the more respected fiddlers conventions and things like that. Him and his girlfriend at the time, Tara Linhart, who had spent time studying music and language in Nepal. We just started kind of chatting, and we're like, it's real similar. The music that they're making here, a lot of it, it's like they're playing on fiddles and banjos. And once we kind of started chatting about this and keeping in touch with it after we left, and just found all these similarities. The Nepali sarangi is basically a cross-tuned fiddle, held played upright, kind of like this, so kind of like a cello. But there's some differences that make it interesting. But the things that they're singing about, the lyrical themes, the scales, the melodies, the rhythms are really, really similar. I would take these recordings that I'd made on my first trip there back to the States, play it for people, and they would think it was like, Celtic, Irish, Scottish, or, from Virginia or North Carolina or something. Wow. So we thought, well, let's take this as far as it can go. Let's do a film on this where we have these old guys in Virginia telling the story of these old guys in Nepal, and the old guys in Nepal telling the story about the old guys in Virginia. Anyway, this worked out really good. We got some amazing interviews. Some of them were the last of, some of them were the only time for the Nepali guys that they would have any kind of media coverage on them. For some of the Virginians, some of them were their last interviews. For example, Mike Seeger, I think we may have been the last folks to interview him and get his take on this interesting connection between these otherwise unrelated things. And for an independent production, that did pretty well. We got it screened at National Geographic, and we would kind of tour around with some Nepali musicians who've made it to the States. There's a very famous Nepali songwriter that lives in Baltimore, so it was really easy to organize tours and that kind of thing. So we kind of do that up and down the East Coast, and brought a couple of Nepali guys to some of those fiddlers conventions a couple years ago, and that's really fun because you think of, it's one of those things where I think the southern white United States gets a hard rap sometimes for some things, and when people have something that they can share, they tend to be a lot more open and realize that there's not these walls and distances between seemingly different groups. Whereas we see the condensed news version of it, which says that everybody different from us is our enemy or something, but that's nonsense. So getting to see these old rednecks hanging out with this our Nepali friend, just so they could jam a little bit, and be staying up late, drinking and playing music and having a good time.
I don't know. I just imagine in my head that you don't listen to music the way other people listen to music. Is your brain always thinking, where did this come from, or where is this melody, or?
Sometimes, but I try not to let the analysis ruin it, because if you get into music theory, you can just destroy your love for music, or any you get into the technicalities of things, learn how the sausage is made. You're not going to want to do it so much, but I don't know. It's there's still tons of sounds. There's tons of combinations of things we haven't thought of. There's rhythmic possibilities that people haven't put together. Whether it's doing that kind of fusion of this tradition with that, or whether it's playing it on new instruments or whatever it is. There's so much new stuff out there. I don't feel it's limited.
So while living in all the different places you've either visited or lived in, there's definitely been some adjustments you've had to make while living there.
Sure.
You want to share some of the more interesting things you've had to adjust?
Oh man, there's a lot. As part of that, I spent about 6 years based on the Thailand, Myanmar or Burma border, and that's definitely it was kind of a wild town. I like cool, dry, mountainous areas. That's kind of where my years in Colorado, Montana really settled my. Those are the climates that I enjoy. So when it's 100 degrees by 10 in the morning, every day, that's a different thing. Just getting used to, keeping yourself free of mosquitoes because of malaria and dengue and that kind of stuff, or some of the random household pets that you'll meet. There's, in Thailand and some parts of tropical Southeast Asia, you'll have instead of toilet paper, you'll have a hose, basically, to spray yourself after using the toilet. But it's also got another good use, which is sometimes you'll have a very dangerous snake kind of hanging out behind your toilet because it's nice and cool there, and you need to clear him out. And of course, he's going to leave. Bathrooms usually have one entrance, so you got to spray this guy, and he's going to cross your feet on the way out. So those are fun. I remember one time some journalism students that I was working with in Thailand had said, "Hey, Jack, come here. We got a snake out here." And I'm like, "Oh, they want to chase the snake and get him out of this wood pile behind their house." So I'm on one side with a stick, just ready to kind of chase this thing away. And they go out and start beating at this wood pile, trying to scare the snake out. He disappears, and they're really disappointed. I'm like, "Oh, why are you disappointed? You got the snake out of the house. He's gone now, right? He went over to that rice field. We're fine now." And they're like, "No, we were hungry. We wanted to chop that guy up." So obviously, there's a lot of crazy foods, and that's one of the fun parts sometimes, and one of the scary parts other times. So
sure.
Depends how adventurous you're feeling and how iron your stomach feels.
Sure.
Are there any places that you haven't visited yet that you still really, really want to go to?
the Earth's a sphere, and when you travel, you're walking a two-dimensional line on it, so you cannot possibly see even close to all of it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't try. I would really, I've known and heard tell of a lot of folks who have crossed Greenland on skis, and I would really like to do that someday. There's a lot of sort of stuff that I'd like to do while winter's still a thing in places where it is. I think that stuff is kind of turning me on more. I've never been to Morocco or Ethiopia. Those are two countries I'd really like to go. I haven't done the calculations in a while. It's probably I don't know how many. It's over 50, but I don't know how many countries. But again, that's not really important to me. It's like you can travel wide and have a lot of passport stamps, or do Europe in 2 weeks or whatever it is, or you can travel really deep and spend more time in less places, but establish bigger, deeper relationships in those things. And I think I've tried to do the latter more often than not.